Joined now by energy specialist and CEO of Sinan Energy, that's Mohamed Madhi, who joins us now. Mohamed, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it, and thank you for joining us here on Newzroom Afrika. Is load reduction a form of hindering on people's human rights, infringing on human rights?
Good afternoon, Arbila, and good afternoon to the viewers. Load reduction in its intended form is not supposed to impact a specific demographic or a specific area other than for technical reasons. It is purely a technical solution to overcome overload on certain substations on the distribution end of a network. So for the way it is meant and the way it was always intended, it's purely a technical consideration and should never be mixed with any other consideration. Whether or not that is happening, we don't know for sure. We need to look at the data. We don't have all of the data. None of that is fully forthcoming. But on the face of it, in its proper application, it should only be a technical consideration.
So if it should only be a technical consideration, then of course Eskom needs to provide data stipulating that indeed it is a technical solution here. Would it be based on the overload of those substations, which ultimately means that it would be in overpopulated areas, and thus saying then that it happens in demographic areas in which you find that there are a lot more people than in other areas?
So I think you're right in terms of Eskom has to provide the information, has to provide the technical data to back up, where the load reduction is happening. Also, we should be very careful that load reduction must not be a cover for load shedding, because load reduction is a very different form of reducing power compared to load shedding. And then to your point, you see, we cannot always make the connection, no pun intended, that overpopulated areas are using more power. Generally, residential areas use less power, depending, of course, on the population density is one of the factors, but also how many businesses, how many industrial areas there may be in that sort of metropolitan area or area under consideration. So if we take an example here in Gauteng, in Ekurhuleni, we have very heavy industry. So we have a large number of areas that is focused on heavy industry, on manufacturing, etc. So even though the population density may not be as high as in other parts of the province, certainly your amount of power that is being used is much higher. So it's not always a straightforward correlation between population density and the amount of power being used.
Yeah, so that becomes, the key question mark. Has it so far looked as though load reduction has been covering for load shedding? Would you say that perhaps is what it at least looks like?
I think there is good reason to believe, given the kind of load reductions that have happened and where it's happened and the timing of that load reduction, that it has been providing some sort of cover for load shedding. I personally would not think that that's impossible. We can't say definitively, but I wouldn't say it's impossible, simply because we know we've been running those open cycle gas turbines very hard. We've been spending a lot of money as a country on diesel through Eskom. So yes, it is possible. Whether it's actually happened or not, the data will tell us.
What's the future solution here, though? I mean, because if people feel disenfranchised and impacted here by ultimately getting load reduction, when the rest of the country and the rest of the province, for that matter, isn't getting their power cut, isn't it then up to Eskom to ensure that there is power, or is it some of the reasoning behind it happening because, well, that area seems to also owe the power utility a lot more money? It's perhaps a demographic that is slightly poorer, of a lower income, and perhaps cannot afford to be paying, etc. What's the actual solution moving forward?
Look, so on to your point about, the demographic and then identifying those areas for load reduction, that's a vicious cycle. Because then what happens is you have poor power delivery, you have increased illegal activity, illegal connections, increased overload on those substations, and the cycle just keeps reinforcing itself. And Eskom keeps thinking that, this is an area that's not very economically attractive to us. So that hopefully is not happening because, as I said, that would be a vicious cycle. The solution is clearly to fix the grids in those areas, prioritize those parts of the distribution network that are overloaded, and, irrespective of the immediate economic return. And this is where the difficulty comes in, because Eskom might say, let's allocate money to areas that are going to have a higher return on income, and for those reasons it falls behind, not because of demographic or any other reason. It's a pure economic consideration. But they have to take that leap and fix those areas where load reduction is likely to occur and spend that money. And I think over the long term only you'll start seeing the benefit of that. And this is the problem. Eskom doesn't have the luxury of looking at the long-term picture and the long-term health of their income and their income profile. The other thing that we really need to do is encourage alternative energy options in all of these areas and provide incentives. So if Eskom is not prioritizing those areas, then let's at least incentivize those particular areas suffering from load reduction, and in fact the country as a whole, with specific tax rebates. We have those at the moment, and we've had them for the last 2 years, and they've worked extremely well. Government is about to reduce those tax incentives, and I think that's going to be one of the biggest mistakes. What they should be doing is actually increasing it so that areas like these could have power at a more affordable rate.
Yeah, but I mean, that last one, particularly, trying to get more alternative power usages or ways to give power, has always been contentious in South Africa, because one, you try to put up a solar panel, for example, sell that back to the grid, and already from that you get a contentious issue within government itself. Then is that really a viable option?
Yeah, so look, it's not contentious at all. You don't have to sell the power back to the grid. You use the power for yourself. And today, alternative energy, solar being one form of alternative energy, is a lot cheaper than grid electricity. So the more that we roll out these alternative, what we call behind-the-meter solutions, the better for everyone, because except perhaps for Eskom. And this is part of the problem. Because you have cheaper power, you have residents and businesses in control of that power with a predictable price path compared to Eskom, where it's more expensive power and you have variable increases on every year. So economically, it's not contentious. Technically, it's not contentious. The only issue is Eskom. But I mean, to their credit, Eskom has not really impeded the growth of behind-the-meter power generation. I don't know if most viewers are aware, but in the last 2 years, we've had almost 5,000 megawatts of behind-the-meter power. Now think about that. That's a huge number, huge amount of power that we've had behind the meter over the last several years, I should say. And that trend needs to continue.
Yeah, and you can't just build more substations, right? I mean, that doesn't change anything, does it?
Well, it certainly reduces the load on the network if you are able to relieve pressure on certain substations. Because what happens is you have a substation in a localized area that is overloaded, and because it's overloaded, not because there's no generation capacity, but just because the substation itself is overloaded and the demand is too much for that particular substation, you have load reduction in that particular area. Now, upgrading the capacity of that substation to accept more power, firstly from the grid, and then distribute that power certainly does help. But of course, in the current situation, we have to make sure that we upgrade in areas where power is going to be available anyway.
Yeah. All right. Well, Mohamed, Madhi, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. A very interesting one. And of course, over the next 3 days, next 2 days after today, then of course, we still have that inquiry continuing into the phenomenon of load reductions happening at the South African Human Rights Commission then, and we'll certainly see what comes out of that. Eskom, of course, itself having to answer. The Minister of Electricity, Kgosientsho Ramokgopa, saying that he will indeed be willing to attend that, being quite specific on wanting to clear the air. Mohamed Madhi, energy specialist and CEO at Sinan Energy, joining us on that conversation.